Chapter 11. Angela sat alone in the house on her grandfather's bed. It was 3 in the afternoon. Jim had left a few minutes before. The party was set for 8. She couldn't have it any earlier because she had things to do to prepare for her visitors, and she was going to do them. Jim hadn't cleaned up after killing her grandfather. What remained of her father's dead was not pleasant to view. It was amazing that she hadn't noticed a smell, but then Jim had stuffed sheets under the door to prevent the stench from circulating to the rest of the house. She shuddered to think what would have happened if Kevin had peeked into her grandfather's room while he had been in the house the previous morning. Sweet Kevin. She wondered if she would ever see him again. A tear ran down her cheek, followed by a sniffle and another tear. She hadn't known her grandfather well, but what she had known she had loved. He had been the only one who'd wanted to take her in when things were tough at home. He'd been happy to have her stay with him. She remembered the day he picked her up at the airport with his latest girlfriend on his arm. She had thought the woman was a second cousin to her or something. She had loved his love, so full of life, so free, so non-judgmental. But what did they know about love? It didn't satisfy their hunger. Therefore, it was useless to them. Their existence seemed incredibly one-dimensional to her. Since that was the case, she doubted they were very smart. She had sure fooled Jim easily enough. He thought she was one of them just because she had tried to eat her dog. So her taste had changed a little. Jim's walking in at that exact moment had been fortunate. He had seen her at her worst, and now he trusted her. Now she would have them all in one place. Mary had never had such an opportunity. Angela suspected Mary had greatly underestimated their numbers. Angela had already decided she was going to blow up the house when she got them all inside. Since she didn't have dynamite, she'd have to do it with gasoline. She couldn't count on being able to detonate the propane tank. Jim had run into it with his truck, and nothing had happened. Sure, if she rigged it with a 5-gallon bottle of gas, it would probably blow, but the tank was outside the house where everyone parked. Because there would be a bright moon, they'd see it if she used such an obvious device. The only place to plant a bomb was in the basement. It was normally closed off from the rest of the house. No one would go down there during the party. She didn't know the exact firepower she'd get per gallon of gasoline, but she figured that if she could obtain 12 5-gallon water bottles and fill them to the brim with gas, she'd be able to kill everybody in the house. If the propane tank blew at the same time, so much the better. But she didn't want to die with the others. Jim had already contaminated her with his blood. It must have been his blood that was changing her, because she'd never gone through the heavy water drinking stage that the others had. Still, she would probably end up like the rest of them, but she had to give herself a chance. Maybe she could learn to resist the urge to kill, even if her body insisted that she feed. She couldn't just light the bomb and have it go off in her face. She needed a fuse, a 2-minute delay at least. Unfortunately, she didn't have a box of unused fireworks lying around. She'd have to make her own. But with what? She couldn't take a long piece of rope and soak it in gasoline. The flame would jump too quickly along the rope and kill her before she could get back up the steps. Plus, the gasoline would smell. She guessed that improved physical strength wouldn't be the only benefit of the human-to-monster transformation. Their senses, including smell, would probably be heightened far beyond the normal human range. She'd have to be careful to wipe all gasoline off the bottles before she sealed them and brought them into the house. Gunpowder was what she'd need to make a fuse. It too would give off a powerful odor, but only once it started burning. Bullet shells had gunpowder in them. Shotgun shells had more. If she could get enough of the latter and get the shot out of them, she could lay down a long enough line on the basement floor to give her time to get out of the house. She could place a piece of rope leading right up to the center bottle of gasoline, which would have a paper cap on it on top with more gunpowder. The stuff would burn through the cap in a second, then bang! No more Mr. and Mrs. Monster. Angela flashed a faint smile at the bloody mess in the bedroom. It was good to have a plan. It would be even better to watch them die. Angela collected her purse and left the house. She didn't have to clean up her grandfather's bedroom. At this party, the mess might even be a drawing card. She worried briefly what she should serve them, then laughed at the absurdity of the idea. What should she serve a bunch of cannibals who were only interested in one thing? Well, she wasn't inviting any of her other friends over to meet these new kids in town. Before she was able to do anything, she had to stop to eat. She bought 4 pounds of steak and ate half of it in a car in a market parking lot. The pounding in her head diminished. It didn't go away, though. That worried her. Even if she survived the blast, how could she live like this? I'll have to face that when the time comes, she whispered to herself, as she wiped her hands off on the bag that held the other 2 steaks. She'd also bought a bottle of Tylenol. She popped 4 pills before starting the car and swallowed them dry. She doubted they'd help. They didn't. It was ironic where she was heading to steal the empty 5-gallon water bottles. Point High. The faculty apparently drank bottled water. Maybe that's why they eat so little red meat, she thought. Anyway, she'd seen the bottles in the back near the guy's showers. There was a whole pile of them, if she remembered correctly. The water guy must have a huge route and only stop by occasionally, she thought. 15 minutes later, Angela discovered that her whole pile equaled only 8 empty bottles. That was 40 gallons of gasoline. A lot, but would it be enough? Who the hell knew? She was stuck on the idea of having at least 60 gallons. It was already close to 4. No time to fool around. She had to get to the sporting goods store in a mall in Bolton by 5 to get the shotgun shells. She'd worry about her other containers on the way home. She made it to the mall by 20 after 4. The shells were stacked behind the counter. She had picked a bad week to buy them. After all, a girl her age had killed 2 people with a shotgun only the week before. The guy at the counter looked as if he had just gotten out of the army. He had a blonde crew cut, square shoulders, a rod up his spine, the whole bit. He wanted to know what she wanted the 20 boxes of shells for. "They're for my grandfather," she said. "Is he with you?" the guy asked. "No." "What does he shoot?" "He target practices mainly. Is there a problem? I'm 18, I have ID. "I like to see it," the guy said. Angela showed him her license. He studied it closely. He seemed to be memorizing her name. "You're from Chicago?" he asked. "I moved here last June," she said. The guy blinked. Something had struck him. "Hey, is your grandfather Mike Warner?" She smiled, although it was forced beyond belief. "Yeah, do you know him?" The guy slapped his knee. "Hell, he used to go out with my sister." Angela winced. "Your sister? How old is your sister?" The guy himself couldn't have been 30. "She's younger than me," he chuckled. "He was a great guy, though. She really liked him. How's he doing?" She swallowed. "Oh, he's still up to his old tricks. He bought himself a shotgun. I don't think he had one when he was dating Dorothy. He hasn't had it long." The guy began to stack up the boxes of shells on the counter. He wasn't worried about her anymore. 20 boxes. "Tell him hello for me. The name's Sam. Tell him Dorothy still says he was the best." Angela had to lower her head. "I will." Before Sam finished ringing up her order, she added 100 feet of rope, a tube of glue, and a razor-sharp hunting knife. She had nothing at home to cut open the shells. All the stuff in the kitchen was dull. Besides, she thought, the knife might come in handy. She drove around Bolton for half an hour, but couldn't find any more 5-gallon water bottles. At a supermarket, she bought 8 2.5-gallon containers. They were much more common, and also picked up a plastic funnel. She had decided how she would get enough gasoline. There were 3 stations in Point. She had a 15-gallon tank in her Camry. She could fill up the tank, drive the car home, and angle it up on some rocks to drain the gasoline, directly into the bottles with the help of the funnel, leaving herself just enough fuel to get back to a station. 60 gallons, 4 tankfuls. Then she'd be set. The thought of revenge drove her on, but she felt terrible anxiety about the evening. The stakes were high. How high she didn't like to guess. The death of the community? The end of the human race? Jesus. There were a dozen things that could go wrong. As she drove back toward Point, she resolved that if she had to, if it looked as even one of them would escape, she would forget the fuse, put her lighter directly to the gasoline, and be the first to go. Kevin would just have to forgive her. She knew how much he'd miss her. She thought about him a lot as she worked, and about Mary, too. Great people. She'd been lucky to meet them. She wished she could go to Kevin for help now. But she vowed to herself that he wouldn't be brought into it. He'd never believe her and would just end up being killed. Angela filled up at the station closest to her house. At her grandfather's place, she easily steered the left side of her car up onto the rocks. The stones worked as well as jacks and left the bottom of the gas tank exposed. She was able to slide one of her empty 5-gallon bottles directly under the bottom cap on the trunk. Then she ran into a problem, or rather, she realized she was going to have a problem before it materialized. Once she took off the cap, how was she supposed to stop the flow of gasoline while she positioned the next bottle? She debated the issue for several minutes without coming up with a brilliant solution. She was still extremely worried about spilling gasoline close to the house. What she did eventually was slowly unscrew the cap. Near the end of the cap strip, the gas began to trickle out. She undid it just a tiny bit more. Better to be patient at this stage, she cautioned herself. The gasoline dribbled into her funnel and began to fill the bottle. It took her 5 minutes to empty 5 gallons. She retightened the cap while she reached for the next bottle, spilling only a few drops. They'd have to have noses like wolves to get a whiff of the stuff, she thought. It was funny, but it was only then that she paused to ask herself what they would be called if they were to be named by someone in the 20th century. They preferred human flesh, but preferred to eat people alive. That made them ghouls or zombies. In a sense, they were from outer space. That made them aliens. But they liked human blood. She liked human blood, for God's sake. And if the myths and her nightmares were true, they mutated into bat-like beings. Yeah, she told herself as she resumed her task. They're vampires. It's too bad they were here before there were crucifixes or garlic. Or I could forget all about this bomb business and just get myself to a religious store and the supermarket. Angela filled close to 3 bottles. She left herself just enough gas to get around to the other side of the lake, and went searching for the next station. She kept an eye on her rearview mirror the whole time, on the lookout for Nguyen. She doubted he was still tailing her. What he had seen at Mary's cabin had scared him. It would have scared any normal person into a mental hospital. And that thing she had done to him just before she left felt as if she had locked his brain neurons in a pattern she chose. It came to her then that Jim had been using the same power on her from the start of his seduction. She liked to think she hadn't come that close to screwing him on a first date without some kind of supernatural influence. The goddamn bloodsucker. How come they didn't sell birth control to protect girls like her from guys like him? Gee, they might sell them soon. They might be the next big market in birth control. Keep those microorganisms from growing in you, girls. Save money on your groceries at the same time. Practice safe necking. Wear count condoms. The only ones you can't bite through. I am sick, she muttered. It was also sick how he still had a sexual hold on her, after all he had done to ruin her life, and the lives of those she loved. Even while she was in the middle of plotting his destruction, her thoughts turned to his kisses, his touch, his body. God, she couldn't let her imagination run down that yellow brick road, or it would constantly be stopping behind the bushes for a quickie. What was craziest of all was that she didn't know she was still a virgin. Had they done it in the middle of the lake last night, while she was having her nightmare? Was she going to have a 2-fanged baby in 9 months that needed 10 blood transfusions a day just to keep its color? Angela took care of her 8 5-gallon bottles, then dumped the water from her 2.5ers into the lake and started on them. They were harder to fill because the openings were smaller, but unlike the 5-gallon bottles, they had caps, which she replaced after they were filled. The bigger bottles she capped with tinfoil, except for one that she had left only half full. She knew a thing or two about how gasoline exploded. It was the fumes that caused ignition. Stick a match directly into a gallon of gasoline, and most likely the match would go out. Her half-empty bottle would be her detonator. She would tie the other bottles tightly around it with her rope, and lead her trail of gunpowder to the top of it. Bang! Bang! They would all go off in the same second. She got one question at the last gas station she went to, which had also been the first station she had visited 80 minutes before. The guy wanted to know what she had done with her first tank full. Angela just smiled. I need a tune-up bad, she said, getting terrible mileage. She had no trouble carrying the bottles inside and stacking them in a corner of the basement. She was stronger. But the smaller bottles, they didn't quite fit with the big ones. She put them aside for a moment while she set to work on the shotgun shells. She would figure out what to do with them later. That was the fun part, getting the fuse ready. The gunpowder reminded her of past 4th of July, happier times. It helped her to think about the past. She couldn't think about the future, and the present was too oppressive. Tears streaked her face. Yeah, she was having a grand time. She'd seen too much blood but hadn't drunk enough. She was literally dying for a drink of the red stuff. Just a sip, but she wouldn't kill to get it. She had taken a vow about that, she reminded herself. Her head throbbed as her heart broke, and her throat cracked on bitter grief. She tried singing to keep up her spirits. They did the monster mash. It was a graveyard smash. It's my party and I'll cry if I want to. But it was all a bad joke, and she wasn't laughing. The hell with them. I'm not serving appetizers. I'll bury what's left of grandfather in the trees. I'll wash his sheets. They'll enter a clean house. They won't leave it, though. They won't leave, she muttered as she finished with the fuse, and once more picked up one of the smaller bottles, wondering where to put it. Chapter 12. Lieutenant Nagoyan stood in the empty warehouse and stared at the dust-free circle on the concrete floor. He wasn't alone. Officer Williams stood nearby holding a flashlight focused on the floor. Williams was not like Martin. He preferred to be called by his first name, Kenny, and he was new to the force, not a wily old devil like Martin. Of course, few cops ever got as tough as Martin had been, even after 20 years on the force. Yet Martin hadn't been tough enough to stop what was happening from killing him. Nagoyan wondered if he was. He kind of doubted it. Nagoyan didn't know why he'd come to the warehouse again. He had already visited it the day before, Saturday, after Angela and her friend had made him aware of his importance. He had found the dry blood in the crack in the floor, as they had undoubtedly likewise discovered. But unlike them, he had been able to have the blood analyzed. It had come from 4 separate people, as Mary had said. Only an hour earlier, he had received a computer report that matched the blood to the blood types of 4 missing people, 2 men and 2 women who had been on their way to the West Coast and who had only stopped in Bolton for a drink. Nagoyan tried to remember if Mary had suspected Jim and his pals of stalking only those who were from out of town. She had made so many other surprisingly accurate remarks in retrospect. Then again, Mary had said they were dealing with monsters. "If you were to stand here and scream, Kenny," Nagoyan said, "do you think someone listening outside could hear you?" Kenny shifted uncomfortably. He had already commented on the bad vibes of the place. Nagoyan didn't know much about vibes, but he sure knew when he didn't like someone, and he had hated Jim Klein from the start. If that kid had killed Martin, he was going to pay for it, and in a bad way. Nagoyan would see to it, and he would make it look legal. There were always ways. "I doubt it," Officer Kenny Williams said, glancing around in the dark. "This is a big place. You'd have to scream awfully loud." Nagoyan knelt and touched the dry blood. As soon as he did, he knew why he'd returned to the warehouse. He needed to see once again that what he was dealing with was real, since he hadn't fully returned to his senses after his encounter with Angela at Mary's cabin. First, there had been Martin lying on the floor with his guts hanging out. Poor Mike. Nagoyan knew his first name. It had stung to see the flies crawling on his friend's face. Suddenly, the war seemed like only yesterday. He thought he had left it all behind. This is worse than anything that happened in Nam. There the enemy had a name. You could see them coming. They were like everyone else. Then he had seen Mary lying dead in Angela's arms, the apparent victim of a suicide. That had added another layer of unreality to the situation. But Nagoyan could have dealt with all of this, even though it caused him pain. But not Angela. Angela not just holding her dead friend, but touching her, wiping the blood off her incision and putting it into her mouth. That was too much. "Dear God," Nagoyan whispered. He felt sick, scared. He had never been this scared, even in the heat of battle with bullets whizzing over his head. Angela had let go of Mary and stood and met his gaze straight, and Nagoyan had felt as if he were being hypnotized by a vulture. It was unthinkable that he had let her walk away. But then, in that place, there hadn't been a chance in hell he could have stopped her. "Quit following me. Let me do what I have to do. By the time you know enough to believe what's happening, you'll already be dead." He still didn't know enough, and now, finally, he had to ask himself if he wanted to know more. But he'd been the one who'd had to tell Martin's wife her husband was dead. He had done the same thing many times in Nam, and then it had steeled him to go on, to get the job done, to drive off the enemy. Of course, the enemy had kept coming and had finally driven him away, but not this time. He wiped the dry blood off on his pants leg and stood up. He turned to Williams. "The identity of the 4 victims has been established beyond doubt?" he asked. "That's what the FBI says," Williams replied. "How old were they?" "I believe they range in age from 22 to 26. "Is the Bureau coming in on this?" Nagoyan asked. "Not yet," Williams added. "They want to see what else you come up with." "Who's this mortician you told me about earlier?" Williams pulled a pad of paper from his back pocket. He studied it in the beam of the flashlight. "His name is Kane. He wants to speak to you about the bodies of the boy and the girl Mary Blank killed last week." "They were buried a few days ago," Nagoyan said. "I know, and he knows that, but he still wants to speak to you. He says it's urgent. I asked him why, but he insisted on speaking only to you. He said you could get him at work tonight. He's there late." "I hope he won't be working too late in the next few days," Nagoyan said grimly. He turned toward the warehouse door. "Let's get out of here, Kenny." They began to arrive promptly at 8. They came individually. Angela met each one at the door. At first she welcomed them and asked if they wanted anything to eat, but since they didn't smile in response or appear hungry, she quit. When there was a knock at the door, she just went over and opened it and let them in. No one spoke. It was like no party she'd ever been to. Everyone just sat and stared at one another. Many sat on the floor. To say that they gave her the creeps was not saying it strongly enough. Their eyes were dark. They reminded her of bats that had hung too long in a cold cave. Even when they sat and looked around, they didn't seem to see much with their physical eyes. Yet they seemed to radiate something akin to radar. Subtle vibrations swept back and forth across the room that she couldn't quite catch. She didn't know what they were picking up from her. Mary had been way off in her estimates. Angela had half the football team and every one of the cheerleaders at her house. There was no one outside those two groups, though. Talk about cliques and peer pressure. You must eat your neighbor, Angie. Everyone's doing it. Angela sat near the door with her head down and played butler. She had 2 big lighters in her pockets and sweaty palms. Where the hell was Jim? Why was he, of all monsters, late? She was so terribly hungry. The pounding in her brain. Would it never stop? Finally, Jim arrived, and when he did, Angela's heart stopped in her chest. Jim had not come alone. Kevin was with him. Kevin, with his big innocent smile. Jim must have talked to him in his human voice the whole way to her door. Jim came in behind Kevin and closed the door. A&W, Kevin said. How come you didn't tell me about your party? Angela had to fight to regain her voice. Why is he here? She asked Jim. Why not? Jim asked, his expression flat. Angie, Kevin said, hurt. He's not one of us, Angela said sharply to Jim. Get him out of here. No, Jim said. Why not? Angela demanded. Excuse me, Kevin said. How come I'm not one of you? We need him, Jim said. What for? Angela asked. Although she had a sick feeling she knew the answer to that question, Jim's answer only made her more sick. For you, Jim said. Angela grabbed Kevin's arm and pulled him toward the door. Get out of here. We're not having a party and you're not invited. I'm sick of you always bugging me. Go annoy some other girl. Stop, Jim said. Yeah, stop, Kevin said, shaking free. But he began to get suspicious. Angela could see it in his face. When Jim moved between them, separating her from Kevin. Angela had experienced the growth of her supernatural strength all day, but she knew she was no match for Jim. He was menacing, and Kevin cowered before him, although he tried to put up a brave front. He poked Jim playfully in the chest. What's wrong? He asked. Haven't had anybody to eat today? Not yet, Jim said. He raised his right hand and struck Kevin hard on the side of the head. Kevin didn't have a chance to react. He slammed into the wall and crumpled onto the floor unconscious. Jim turned to Angela, who was frozen in horror. Have you had anything to eat today? Jim asked. Angela ran. She didn't know where she was going and as a result didn't get far. One of the others tripped her and she sprawled onto the floor. Back on her knees, ready to make another dash for it, she was struck by something hard and powerful on the side of the head. Like Kevin, she was slammed into the wall and she crumpled to the floor. She didn't immediately lose consciousness, though. Rolling onto her back, she saw them gathered around her, 10-foot-tall statues from the Wax Museum of Horrors. Sticky warm fluid slid over the side of her face. Jim knelt and touched her head. When he withdrew his fingers, they were red. He touched them to his lips, tasting her. Almost ready, he said. Angela blacked out. Mortician Kane met Lieutenant Nagoyan at the back door of his establishment. Kane resembled a corpse more than a live man, Nagoyan thought. The man was elderly, white-haired, with an unnaturally smooth red face. He had on a thick layer of makeup and smelled heavily of cologne. Better than embalming fluid, Nagoyan figured. He had big, moist, pale blue eyes. They appeared to be made of glass. Nagoyan didn't understand how someone could grow up wanting to be a mortician, but he supposed it was good someone had such an inclination. I'm so happy you could come, Kane said, using both palms to shake Nagoyan's hand. Nagoyan had called him a few minutes earlier and told him he was on his way. He was alone because he had told Kenny Williams to go home to his wife and kids. If he could help it, he wasn't going to lose any more men this weekend. No problem, Nagoyan said, stepping into the man's laboratory. 2 stainless steel tables glistened beneath harsh white lights. The body of an old lady lay on the far one. She was dressed in a long white wedding dress and had on ruby-colored slippers. Kane had obviously been doing her makeup when he stopped to answer the door. Kane led him past the woman. "That's Mrs. Bevan," Kane said. "She made a vow to her husband to reenact their wedding once they were in heaven." "Her husband approved of this?" Nagoyan asked, gesturing to the white gown. "I don't know. He's dead. He died many years ago." "I see," Nagoyan said. "What did you want to show me?" "These," Kane said, stopping in front of twin metal containers set on a waist-level table. They were cylinder-shaped, both about 4 feet tall and a foot in diameter. Even before Kane removed the lid of the one on the right, Nagoyan got a whiff of the repulsive odor. It was unlike anything he had smelled before, and yet it reminded him of a smell he'd experienced many times in Nam. The stench of death, of decay, of life lost. Yet this was worse than any rotting body on the battlefield. "My lord," Nagoyan said, taking a step back. "I should have warned you," Kane apologized. "I used these containers to hold the blood I drained from bodies before I embalmed them. I used this particular container for the blood of both of the teenagers who were killed at the party. I understand that you are in charge of that case?" "That is correct." "Has the girl said why she did it?" Kane asked. "The matter is still under investigation." "I understand," Kane said quickly. "Anyway, I drained the blood of both of those young people and put it in this container. That was on Monday, the day before the funerals. Ordinarily, I dispose of the blood immediately, the same day, but I was unexpectedly called out of town on a business appointment and was late taking care of the matter. In fact, it was only today, while working on Mrs. Bevan, that I remembered I had yet to get rid of the material." He frowned and nodded to the container he had uncovered a moment ago. "But when I went to pour it away, it was gone." "The blood?" Nagoyan asked. "Yes." "Perhaps you disposed of it and forgot." "Impossible," Kane said. He cleared his throat. "I believe the blood was stolen. The lock of my back door had been forced open when I returned from my business trip on Thursday." "I hadn't noticed." "I had the lock fixed immediately. I could not have my establishment unlocked at any time. If I were to have one body stolen, it would permanently ruin my reputation." "I can imagine," Nagoyan said. "Were there any bodies here while you were gone?" "No." "Who do you think took the blood?" Kane was disappointed. "I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on the matter." "I'm sorry, I can't." Nagoyan gestured to the empty container. He assumed it was empty. He couldn't see over the top of it. "What's making that awful smell?" "That's the other reason I called you out. There is something in the blood of those kids who were killed." "What do you mean?" "I'll show you." Kane took a pair of gloves from his back pocket and put them on. He reached up and tilted the container slightly, being careful not to let it topple. A mass of what could have been dark green algae was growing inside. The stench unbelievable. Nagoyan felt his eyes burning and took another step back. "What is that?" he asked, repulsed. "I don't know," Kane said gravely. "In 40 years of experience, I have never seen anything like it. I tell you, those teenagers' blood was contaminated." "With what?" Nagoyan demanded. "I don't know." "Some kind of organism must have grown in a container on the blood that remained." Kane was firm. "No, I realized my leaving the blood in the container for so long before disposing of it must give you the impression that I am careless. But I assure you that I am seldom anything but a perfectionist. I sterilized these 2 containers before I embalmed the 2 teenagers. There were no organisms in the containers at that time. I could swear to that in court. Also, whatever is growing in here is very unusual." Kane tilted the can more on its side, revealing a portion of the backside. A narrow trail of the green stuff had made its way down the rear of the container. The trail led across a short distance to the second container. Nagoyan had to lean over to see where it was heading, and was surprised to find it had already crawled halfway up the back of the second container, which appeared to be well sealed. "Crawled? It's not an animal." Nagoyan didn't like to think it was an animal. "What's in this other container?" Nagoyan asked. "Mrs. Bevan's blood." "Interesting." "Yes, indeed." Kane was grim. "It's as if this green matter is hunting her blood." He leaned closer. "Whoever stole the blood from this container wanted it for some special purpose." Chapter 13. Angela dreamed of the alien world, the day the world died. The world remembered it well. Yes, even its own end. Because the world was unique, it could die and be reborn. The mind of the world took birth in Angela's mind in the nightmare. She saw what it saw. She felt its shock, its terror, as the men from the third planet, the one they called Earth, appeared to erect their mighty machine. The world was almost helpless against this invasion. The men from the third planet had been warned, and didn't at first allow their silver spaceships to land on the surface. They knew what the surface of the world could do, how the infection could get inside them and begin to eat them unless they ate others of their own kind. That's what brought on the victim's hunger. The parasite had to be fed, or else it would feed on its host. It hungered for the living iron in the dying blood, to bring about the polarity, the magnetism, that led to union with the mind and the world. It wasn't sufficient to be infected with the parasite for the transformation to happen. That could make a human being sick, nothing more. It was only when the polarity in the blood of the victim reached a certain level that the phase transition to magnetism occurred. Then the hunter and the hunted became one. Of course, once a human was fully transformed, he could change others simply with his blood. He would change them rapidly, more rapidly than the water could. He could take over a whole planet with his blood. But these men would not give the world a chance to send its cells into their bodies to start the process. High up in the sky, they sent forth a burst of light that exploded as it touched the world, rending the ground, carving out a crater where not a single one of the world's cells survived. Only then did the spaceships slowly descend into the safe haven of the exploded crater. It was there that they began to erect their machine. The world watched at first. It could do little more until the ones it had converted arrived on the scene. The men worked quickly. The thing they built began to take shape in less than a day. Yet it was not done at the end of the day, and the world waited until the sun had vanished to send forth its hungry legions. They came by the thousands. For eons the world had stored them up in the bowels of its caves, not just people from the third world, but visitors from faraway stars as well, changed beings who lived only to eat and serve the will of the world. Once more, the third world men had been warned. They never slept, and were able to activate powerful red and green energy beams at the first sign of attack. These rays cut down the world's legions of walking and flying dead. In a short time, there is nothing but millions of twitching limbs surrounding the crater the men had carved for themselves. Many of the limbs, driven by the will of the world, rose on their fingers and toes and wings to try to reach the enemy. But these, too, the men fired upon, and soon there was only smoking ash in place of what had once been the world's greatest defense. But in the midst of this conflict, one of the men grew careless and stepped beyond the confines of the crater. The world was on him in a moment, pushing its seed into his bloodstream. The man screamed as he was attacked, and the other men were warned. They didn't run to his aid. Instead, they fired their energy beams upon him without mercy. They'd had experience, the world thought. Before the men destroyed their partner, the world got a glimpse of the man's mind and understood that the machine the men were erecting was meant to rupture the crust of the world. It was a gigantic bomb. The men had come to kill the world. They wished to kill it because the transformed beings the world had sent back to the third planet had all but destroyed the human race. These men, the world saw, and a handful of others on the third planet, were all that was left of a vast civilization, a culture that would now in all probability become extinct. The world didn't know what to do. It could do nothing. The men were determined. The world watched as the men finished their machine the next day, and then retreated into space. The world knew that the machine continued to tick. It could hear the sound of the machine's internal parts moving. It knew the countdown was on. Then the mighty bomb exploded, and a deep pain shot through the mind of the world. A mushroom of fire appeared, and the world felt its insides scream. The men had accomplished their goal. The crust was ruptured. The spin of the world did the rest. Huge chunks of its body flew off into space. Then the incredible pressures at the center of the world were released, and the world exploded in a horrendous burst of energy, and the agony was beyond relief, until it stopped. The pain suddenly stopped. The world was gone. It was dead. Lifeless rocks tumbled through the void where once the world had lived and eaten supreme. Yet a few small pieces of the world survived in a confused state. Those chunks of the world's crust held the cells of the world. They floated for eons without consciousness but no comprehension. They knew only their hunger, which they could no longer satisfy, and their hatred of the men who had destroyed their home. Above all else, they vowed that if there was ever a chance, they would take vengeance upon the people of the third planet. In time, it looked as if a few of the pieces were to be given that chance, because as they tumbled through space, some pieces passed close to the third planet. Around and around the sun they went, until a few actually hit the planet. Of those, most landed in the vast oceans and were lost, but 2 hit the land, and once more there was great fire and pain for the feeble remnants of the world's once vast mind. Almost all of the cells were destroyed in the heat of the landing, but a few lived in the rock that was eventually softened by the mighty glaciers. The glaciers left many lakes behind, the waters in which the cells eventually found release. There, in 2 small bodies of fresh water on the third planet, the cells multiplied and waited for the day they could once more cause the blood to flow in those who had destroyed their home. The sweet red blood, the only thing that truly satisfied the hunger. Angie, Kevin said. Angela opened her eyes. She saw the ceiling of the basement, the exposed boards of the floor above, a single bulb burning bright. She smelled blood, the sour taste of copper in the air, and beneath that, the faint aroma of sweet iron. She moved her jaw and heard it crack. Her face was covered with gook. She could feel its dried stickiness stretch as her skin flexed. Blood, she thought. An angry heart pounded inside her skull. Every beat brought greater and greater pressure, demanding relief. She tried to sit up, and the pain went off the scale. Ouch, she moaned, squeezing her eyes shut and doubling up. Kevin held her a moment, trying to help her. Don't get up, he said. Just sit. We don't have anywhere to go at the moment anyway. She reopened her eyes to see she was sitting in a puddle of blood. It was caked over her face. Her fingers flew up to her head. She had a cut, a bad bruise at the back of her skull, but she couldn't have lost all the blood she was sitting in. She glanced at Kevin. He didn't look that much worse off for Jim's blow, although the left side of his face was puffy. He wasn't soaked in the stuff. What had they done to her? Poured a gallon of blood down her throat while she lay unconscious on her back? She had a horrible taste in her mouth, but it didn't rival the pounding inside her head. Nothing could touch that. She was going to have to eat something soon, or she was going to have to saw the top of her head open. How long have you been awake? Angela asked, pulling the front of her shirt out of her pants and rubbing her face. Just a couple of minutes, Kevin said. His eyes strayed to the ceiling. We're locked down here. They're still up there. She listened. The boards creaked overhead. I'm not surprised. Kevin rubbed his head. What the hell's going on? Do they blame us for the deaths of Todd and Kathy? I doubt they're worried about that at the moment. Then why did they clobber the 2 of us? What are they all doing here? Jim told me you were having a party. This is not a party, Angela said. I can see that. Tell me what's going on, please. We are being held captive by 30 vampires from outer space. Angie? That's all I know. Her nightmare came back to her right then. The ruin of the ancient human civilization, the men's bomb, the death of the evil world, the asteroid's long tumble through time and space, and the rebirth of the parasitic cells in the water of the 2 lakes. She added, Don't ask me any more. Kevin was impatient. That's not good enough, Angie. She winced in pain. I'm sorry. He was instantly regretful and reached out to touch her head. We have to get you to a doctor, he said. She was very aware of his hand on her skin. It was almost as if each one of the cells in the region where he was making contact had its own unique radar to detect different characteristics of his flesh. She was especially sensitive to the blood in his fingers, flowing beneath the surface of his skin, such a frail sheet of skin, that simple layer of humanity that took only moments to peel away. The pounding in her head reached a feverish pitch. She pushed his hand away. I'm all right, she said, getting up without his help. A wave of dizziness passed through her, but soon she was steady on her feet. The basement had no windows, of course. She knew that without checking. There was only one way out, the door up to the first floor of the home. She strode over to the corner where she had hidden her bottles of gasoline under a big blue plastic tarp. She pulled away the covering. The bottles were still there, but the fuse was gone. She searched in her pockets. They had taken her lighters. What's in those bottles? Kevin asked. He was not stupid. The way they were roped together said she was not storing up fresh drinking water. Gasoline? She said. His eyes widened. Are they going to blow us up? No, she said. I was going to blow them up. Why, for God's sakes? For the sake of God, she told him. She understood right then that there was no getting away. The best she could hope for was to stop them. It was going to mean that both she and Kevin would die, and that made her sadder than she could bear. But it was the way it had to be. He was watching her with fear in his eyes. Have you lost your mind? He asked. Kevin, she said sadly, those people up there are evil. Mary was right. They kill others. There's no way to convince the authorities of what they're really like, because for a long time they look like you and me, but they're not like us. They've got something growing in them that they've got to feed, that pushes them to take revenge against all of humanity. There's no way to stop them but to kill them. You sound as bad as Mary. Mary's dead, she cried. He was shocked. What happened? They killed her. He tried to hug her. Angie. Stay away, she said, pushing him aside a bit too hard. He almost fell down. She reminded herself how strong she had become. She seemed a lot stronger than she had been when Jim had arrived with Kevin tonight. Had they really poured blood down her throat? Whose blood had it been? Kevin was totally confused. What's wrong with you? He pleaded. Right now, I have many personal problems, but I can't go into all of them. She scanned the basement. There were the concrete walls and one wood-paneled. Her grandfather never finished paneling the room. Do you have any matches? She asked quietly. No. Do you have a lighter? I don't smoke, Angie. You're not going to try to light those bottles off. She stared at him straight in the eye. Once more, as in Mary's cabin, she felt a magnetic current flow up her spine, into her head, and out her eyes. The invisible mind twister. She hoped it was working well this time. But I am, Kevin, she said softly. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, I want you to stand there and do nothing. I don't want you to interfere. Suddenly, he was breathing hard, sweating profusely. You can't, he whispered. I can. I will. Don't interfere. She tore at a corner piece of the wood paneling. Tightening her fingers on the wood, she heard it crunch beneath the pressure of her grip. Her tendons felt like steel cords. She had broken off a 3-foot section of splintered wood, which she snapped in two across her knee. One end looked like a jagged spear. She returned to her bottles in a corner and stabbed the nearest one. Gasoline gurgled onto the floor. Angie, Kevin croaked at her back, frozen in place. Shut up. Be still. You must stop. I'll stop when they're stopped, she said. She knelt and stood the jagged piece up in the middle of the growing puddle of gasoline. She gripped the top of it tightly with her left hand. In her right hand, she held the second piece of wood. The monsters upstairs obviously had never been Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, and didn't know all the games she knew. They had taken away her lighters. Big deal. She just needed one good spark. She struck the piece of wood hard along the length of the other piece. She was strong. It would take only a few tries. She closed her eyes. It would be over soon. But she weakened. She had driven herself within an inch of death, and perhaps the alien organism that flowed in her veins had even helped her so far. But the human part of her couldn't bear it. She was only 18. She didn't want to die. Certainly she didn't want to die by her own hand. Tears burst out of her eyes, and the pieces of wood in her hands shook and fell into the gasoline. Blood and tears and gasoline. She tasted all three of them at once, a potion of despair. I can't, she moaned. The next thing she knew, Kevin's arms were around her, comforting her. His gentle words in her ear told her everything was going to be all right, but his touch brought her no relief. It only hammered on the already unbearable pounding in her skull. He turned her toward him, and she smelled him 1,000,000 times more intensely than the way she used to smell the meat on the barbecue when she was starving, and it was almost, but not quite, ready to eat. I am so ready. God. We'll get out of here, Kevin promised her. She studied him. Such a beautiful boy, so handsome. He had never really turned her on before, and now she couldn't imagine why not. She stroked his hair. She felt the bump where he had hit the wall. He had broken skin there. Taking a deep breath, she caressed the spot. It seemed to bring him pleasure, just her touching his head. He closed his eyes briefly. She withdrew the finger and licked it quickly with her tongue. A drop of blood, a pinch of pleasure. She touched his small wound again. She dug into it deeper this time, using her nails. Ouch, he said, drawing back slightly. His eyes popped open. I'm sorry, she said quickly. She had more blood in her hands now, but she couldn't lick it with him watching her. He wouldn't approve. He stared at her. You look different. You look good. Really? Yeah, she croaked. His eyes were sort of bloodshot. She could count the veins around his irises. She could almost count the veins inside his pupils, the openings into his brain. She felt as if she could just reach out and touch his brain, squeeze it a little. She could make him feel a little better, and herself a whole lot better. It was the thought of these little things that seemed to ease the pounding in her head. She really had to stop it from pounding, or else she was going to go mad. Kiss me, she said suddenly. What? Kiss me, he chuckled. Angie, we have to get out of here. I know. Kiss me. She grabbed him and pulled him closer. Now! He kissed her. He was not as aggressive as good old Jimmy Boy, but he was sweet, nevertheless. He kissed with more style in a way, more flavor. She nibbled on his lip a tiny bit. He tasted just fine in her book. He drew back. He had blood on his mouth. My, where had that come from? It didn't look bad on him. He didn't need to wipe it away, but he did anyhow. You bit me, he said, looking at the back of his hand. I'm sorry, she panted. Did it hurt? No, but kiss me again? I can't do it right now. Yes? She grabbed his head and pulled his lips onto hers. She sucked on them hungrily, and when he tried to pull away, she didn't let him. The pleasure was exquisite, but the more she had, the more she wanted. They were sitting in a puddle of gasoline, but they were fanning the wrong kind of flames, the easy ones that did not require the courage to look death in the face. This she knew. This she remembered. Deep inside, a warning bell finally went off. It told her that she was doing exactly what she had sworn that she would never do. But the bell could hardly compete with the pounding in her cranium. The bell was a drugstore-sized alarm. The pounding was being rung by the hammer of Thor himself. Her need to feed drowned out everything else. She began to cry again, even as she held on to him. She had told him to stay away. She had told him she just wanted to be friends. It was all his fault. Angie, he cried as he burst from her grasp. He was breathing hard again. His eyes blinked rapidly. Half his face was smeared with blood. What's wrong with you? He demanded. She spoke with feeling. I just want you so much. He forced a smile. I feel like you're trying to take advantage of me. She tried to smile. I want to. I'm sorry. You don't have to be sorry. No. No. He brushed away a tear from her cheek. You're scared, but everything's going to be all right. I'm going to take care of you. Really? He grinned. Really, A&W. There are no monsters. Thank God. She took his hands in hers and kissed them. Then she slipped her hands around the back of his neck, massaging him lightly at the base of the skull with her fingertips, relaxing him. Once more he closed his eyes. She didn't want him to open them again. She leaned forward and opened her mouth and kissed him once more, deeper than ever, so deep she felt she was inside of him, a part of him, and that he was a part of her. Their two hearts beat inside each other in ecstasy. She wanted them to be that close. It was more than a physical craving. It was spiritual as well. It was meant to be. She could see that now. But she wasn't like the others, because she didn't want him to suffer. Not her dear Kevin. She just wanted to love him, to make him hers. She tightened her grip on the back of his head. I love you, Kevin, she whispered. I will always love you, forever and ever. She snapped his head around as hard as she could. She heard the bones in his neck crack. Not like at a chiropractic office, though. Oh no, much louder cracks. Kevin slumped in her arms. He was no longer breathing hard. Not at all, really. He was just asleep, she thought. She brushed his hair from his face. He could sleep as long as he liked. She kissed his cheek. Love you, she said. She opened her mouth and closed her eyes. She started. Her mind left her. It was a good thing.